Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered the withdrawal of most Russian forces from Syria.
Считаю, что задачи, поставленные перед Министерством обороны и вооруженными силами, в целом выполнены. Поэтому приказываю министру обороны с завтрашнего дня начать вывод основной части нашей воинской группировки из Сирийской Арабской Республики.
It's a surprise announcement and has been welcomed, but one question does come to mind. Why now?
Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain Khan. With the Russian withdrawal from Syria, is the Russian position within Syria going to go stronger or weaker? What will be the geopolitical implications of the Russian withdrawal from Syria? How will it be affecting the Middle East? Today, to discuss the Russian withdrawal, we have with us today a former American colonel, Anthony Shaffer. Anthony Shaffer serves as a member of the U.S. Nuclear Strategy Forum and is a senior fellow to the London Center for Policy Research. He frequently appears on the American media discussing numerous topics. Welcome to our show, Anthony Shaffer. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure to have you on Tactical Talk.
Sure, thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Colonel Shaffer, what was the reason behind the Russian intervention within Syria?
The primary reason that Russia moved into Syria to conduct a number of operations was primarily to support Bashar al-Assad, their proxy within the region. The Russians have a long record of standing behind Bashar al-Assad, which includes not only arming him, providing him chemical weapons, but also has included essentially intelligence and other support. The Russians' direct interdiction in the effort was meant to both stabilize President Assad, as well as clarify their interest in the region. They have very, very clearly stated through their actions that their intention is to maintain influence within the region, and by doing so, creating military installations, expanding the military installations they had in Syria, and by allying with essentially the Iranians in some instances regarding what we're calling the Damascus Pact, where you see the Russians working with the Iranians taking over and holding parts of Iraq, and the whole region essentially being kind of set up to form lines between the Sunni and Shia. The Shia being the Iranians and those in the region aligned with the Russians and Syria, and the Sunni being the Saudis and their satellite states, which include Jordan and in many ways Egypt as well.
Have they achieved their goals?
The Russians have not achieved their goal yet, although I think it was dramatic that they announced that they were pulling out their forces last week from Syria. I don't believe it for a minute. I believe that the Russians have done a number of things to essentially establish added stability within the areas that President Assad and the Syrian government still control. With that said, I don't believe they're going home. I don't believe they're going to diminish in any real way their capacity to conduct military operations in the region, nor their profile in the region. The primary interest, this is my judgment, the primary interest of President Putin, the leader of Russia, is to work slowly but diligently to obtain essentially influence and control of about 80% of the world oil. To do that, they have to work with the Iranians, and they have to be very careful not to upset too much of the status quo as they move in to do that. But the intention, clearly in my judgment, is that over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see the Russians continue to insinuate themselves in the region. So I don't believe for a minute that while they may lower the number of military aircraft or personnel or armored vehicles in Syria itself, I don't believe for a minute they're quote-unquote going home.
Colonel Anthony Shaffer, why are they pulling out, and in what capacity are they pulling out from Syria?
The Russians are pulling out, according to their basic narrative, because they've accomplished a number of their primary initial military objectives for the region. That is to say that they've achieved some level of stability within the region and areas controlled by Bashar al-Assad, and therefore they've said they can begin the troop withdrawal. I believe that they are pulling some forces back. I think there's two reasons why they're doing it. First, I think that there's been a great deal of stress brought to bear on the Russian military. This is a military which is not used to doing expeditionary operations, and this is very much expeditionary for them. So I think there's a need for a pause, if you will, to both replace people who have been fighting in the region. The Russians have sustained losses, as well as essentially pull a level of replacement of the military weaponry which has been employed. There's been a number of reports, I believe credible, showing that the Russians have indeed stressed their military, stressed the hardware, stressed everything that they have. The fact that they've had to move it, they've had to use it in high-tempo combat operations, and frankly, the Russians have not been very well known for being able to sustain a gear as much as we are. So I think the ghost of some of the Afghan experience, their invasion of Afghanistan, is coming back to haunt them now, by the fact that they're learning lessons about what is necessary to sustain military operations, military gear in a high tempo environment. So I think this is in many ways political, obviously, but more importantly, I think there's some real issues behind why they're essentially taking this military pause, this combat pause. And so again, I don't believe for a minute this is permanent. I think the Russians have learned some lessons. I think they're going to go back and take a look at how they can continue to sustain military operations in Syria, and probably replace some people, send some new units in, much like we do. The military, U.S. military, tends to rotate people in and out of a combat zone for a number of reasons. So I think the Russians are more doing a military strategic pause than they are actually a withdrawal from Syria.
What geopolitical position do you see of America within the Middle East in the coming days after the Russian withdrawal?
Well, I think the United States is maintaining a position of neutrality, which is creating two things. First, the perception that the United States is not really interested in supporting our traditional allies in the region. Ambassador Ryan Crocker testified about 3 weeks ago to the fact that our Sunni allies, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, and those in Iraq, which we were supporting, all feel that the United States has abandoned its commitment to them to sustain a partnership. Secondly, this has allowed for the Iranians and the Shia to expand their influence within the region, and thereby allowing, by proxy, the Iranians to then work with the Russians in a more concerted way. I do believe this is what the United States will continue to do with the current president, President Obama, in office. There's been an attempt by this White House to, I would say, flat out pander to the Iranians, to the Shia, for purposes of trying to create a perception, at least, that the United States wants to work with the Persians on a lot of military issues. And this is something that has caused a great deal of chaos within the ranks of the Shia, of the Arab allies, within the context of regional stability.
Do you see America on a stronger position or on a weaker position? How do you see the future?
America has a very weak position in the Middle East, as do many of our allies. I think in many ways we've seen some level of the French and British both step up where the United States has not. I don't see the European Union taking any strong position. But with that said, the United States is diminished. Again, our traditional allies don't trust us. And I think what the future holds for America is very grim. We have a number of months now. Here we're taping this the first day of spring. We have a number of months before our national elections for president. That's November of this year. And between then and now, there's going to be chaos. Essentially, President Obama and his national security team are lame ducks. The Pentagon is doing the best it can to try to reestablish some semblance of strategy, military strategy, for purposes of bringing stability to the regions that we are involved in, such as Iraq. Over this weekend, there's been a report of U.S. casualties. Two U.S. individuals were killed in a suicide bombing in Turkey. A U.S. Marine was killed in Iraq, incidental to fighting against ISIS. So the Pentagon's intention, as far as I can tell, is to continue to be engaged, to continue to conduct military operations within the region, and to address global strategic threats as best they can. And that includes Russia, that includes China, that includes ISIS. With that said, though, without a clear national strategy, what I would call a grand strategy, it's a term of art that we use as planners, without that vision as put together by the White House, we don't have a clear vision of how to move forward as a nation, nor how to use our means of national influence. And that's not just military, that's diplomatic and economic and and communications and that sort of thing. So, in absence of that grand national strategy, I think you'll see the Pentagon attempt to do what it can within the context of its mission to protect the United States' interests and its people. At the same time, I don't think we're going to see any real path forward through the chaos until a new president is elected later this year, at least for the United States. And I think whoever that person is elected to be president will determine a great deal about how much the United States remains directly involved in the effort. And I got to tell you, I'm not impressed with any candidate at this point in time. No candidate's been able to establish a clear understanding or a clear path of what they would do as the commander-in-chief, nor have they addressed the policy issues which I've just outlined regarding strategic thinking and a grand strategy of how to essentially reestablish reasonable engagement of the United States in these efforts to help our allies and bring stability to the world as the chaos of ISIS has been able to subsume a great deal of the Middle East region.
Thank you so much, retired Colonel Anthony Shaffer, for being on Tactical Talk. It was a pleasure having you.
Thanks for having me.
This was Anthony Shaffer discussing the Russian withdrawal and the American position within the Middle East. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain Khan. Take care and goodbye.